Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome. It's great for you to be joining with us tonight. My name is Ben Wilder. I am the director of the Desert Laboratory on Tumamoc Hill. And it is my honor to be speaking with you tonight from Tumamoc Hill, known in O'odham as Chimamagi Duag, Horned Lizard Mountain, on the ancestral lands of the Sabaibre and O'odham peoples. This volcanic hill is of prominent ancestral, cultural, and sacred significance to the O'odham nations, including the O'odham Nation, Gila River Indian Community, Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, the Akchin Indian Community, the Hopi tribe, and the Pasco Yaqui tribe. The Desert Laboratory recognizes the cultural significance of Chimamagi Duag as the bedrock of our institution and our future actions. In this light, it is such an honor to be communicating to you about this lecture series for this spring, Agave Renaissance. So this is our second installment. If you happen to miss our first presentation, and again, we're doing pairings of the presentation, a presentation on Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. and then following on Thursday, also at 6 p.m. is a tasting. So last month we were joined by Wendy Hodgson for the presentation, and then paired with David Suro and Gary Nabhan with Doug Smith in the tasting. So it's hard to have a better kickoff to a series than that. And all of the previous presentations are archived on our website. If you do search Agave series, Tumamoc Hill, or Agave Renaissance, Tumamoc, you'll find it and you can watch them and share them with people as well. So this whole effort, this whole process is made possible by the Friends of Tumamoc program. So I know many of you tuning in tonight are Friends of Tumamoc. Thank you. You make our outreach efforts and our stewardship of the hill possible. So I really, really appreciate your generosity and contributions. And then we're partnering with this series with El Crisol, Doug and Amy Smith, and Hotel Congress with Todd Hanley and the whole Hotel Congress family and the Agave Heritage Festival. So both of whom are leaders in the field of agave spirits and agave culture, and it was just a natural partnership to be working with them on this. The whole thrust of this series is really digging into this reciprocal relationship between plants and people. And I think I mentioned it last time, but I want to mention it again, is that we really collectively need examples of relationships between people and the biodiversity around us that are positive, that do not end in the loss of species or populations. And this long-term relationship between people and agave is exactly the opposite of that negative story. And so that's what we're focusing on from so many different angles. And so tonight we're coming home, very close to home, and going to be hearing from the perspective of Tumamoc agaves. So one of, there's so many joys I have in this position, being director of the lab, which is truly my dream job. And one of them is I feel like I have the most incredible starting lineup and like the deepest bench you can imagine of experts and people to work with. And Paul and Susie are at the very top of that list. It is such, I mean, every time I get to be in the field with them here on the hill, or we did and some of you maybe on this call were able to join us in Terraces, Sonora, just about a year ago, pretty much exactly a year ago, was one of the last pre-pandemic trips we were able to do. It just always, it doesn't just educate me, it literally changes the way I see the landscape, and that iterative process of learning to see elements that are kind of invisible to me, and then all of a sudden it clicks and it's all around you. And so that's exactly what happened with the rock piles here on the hill that we'll be talking about. Let me give you a bit of a more kind of formal introduction to both Susie and Paul, and so you can understand their background. So with degrees from the University of Arizona in anthropology and an interdisciplinary PhD in arid land resource sciences, Susie combined these disciplinary backgrounds in research, teaching, and outreach. Her primary focus is Hohokam archaeology of southern Arizona and the ethnobotany and agricultural traditions of the Sonoran Desert before and after Spanish contact. Special interests are regional settlement patterns, the organization of non-state archaeological societies, archaeological palynology, the structure of pre-Hispanic productive landscapes, and Hohokam cultivation of agave. And I should also say work with agave fiber as well. Both Paul and Susie have an incredible collection of agave fibers that if you've been to some of the events we've had here at the Desert Lab, they brought up and shared with us, which are pretty magnificent. Paul's interest in training parallel much with Susie, are in anthropological archaeology with a particular emphasis on the organization of Neolithic societies, regional sediment patterns and landscapes, and pre-Hispanic agriculture. Publications and field research include investigations in North America, Southwest and Southeastern United States and Northwest Mexico, and South America, focus on early coastal fishermen in southern Brazil. Paul has studied continuously over the last 40 years, both the Hohokam and Terraces traditions of Arizona and Sonora. With the Arizona State Museum and Anthropology faculty, he developed and coordinated the interdisciplinary Southwest Land, Culture, and Society program that serves as an undergraduate and graduate concentration. They say emeritus before their names, but I don't believe it. They're as active as ever and so generous with their time. Paul and Susie, thank you, welcome. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. And indeed, we have spent much of our time, over actually 50 years, doing research together. And we have particularly enjoyed the work at Tumamoc Hill. So I'm going to share my screen now for a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, I hope everyone can see.
I'll just confirm that looks great.
Okay, well, this is about Tumamoc Hill. And so it's kind of strange, you might think, that we're beginning with Oaxacan landscapes, where you see agave in all sorts of combinations, from large, formally laid out fields to casual agave borders, to cornfields, to abandoned terraces with an occasional relict agave lurking about. And the reason I started with this is that it really set me on the path to studying agaves at Tumamoc Hill that were not at all closely associated with Oaxaca, but I spent the summers from 1967 through 1972 in Oaxaca and became very, very familiar with cultivation of agave. And in fact, I experienced the hospitality role of mezcal in this place, because if I was ever invited to someone's house, there was a formal welcoming ceremony in which both husband and wife came to the door and served a little copa of mezcal. And after that, hospitality also necessitated serving a bowl of chocolate atole. Really a charming practice, and brought the appreciation of mezcal home to me. Okay. When I was in Oaxaca, I noticed that on the archaeological terraces, and I was there as an archaeologist, there were very distinctive stone tools, and they were associated with the harvest of agave. These flat kind of tools that are called knives, and these steep edge scrapers called pulping planes. So when I came back to Arizona, I found that Paul had been surveying on Perry Mesa, just north of Phoenix. And during the course of that survey, he had identified some very interesting and continuous terraces. And on those terraces in that area, there was agave growing. So also on these terraces were those distinctive stone tools I had seen in Oaxaca that were for harvesting agave. I wrote a report about one set of fields, and I really was uncertain at that time whether cultivated agave could be here in the Southwest US because there was no ethnographic record of it, at least not in large fields that had a kind of agricultural feature called rock piles. But anyway, there was one sentence in the report I wrote that said possible agave horticulture, little knowing that that would set the path for us to do research for many years after. This agave and others, there are quite a few chrysantha, agave chrysantha, and Perry on Perry Mesa. Okay, now we come to the start of our actual presentation on the Tumamoc Hill agave. And I included these figurines here because these are the people who were the farmers of the area here near Tucson. These figurines date to the time just as large rock pile fields were being constructed on many of the bajadas or outwash slopes from the mountains here around Tucson. And just to give an impression of how these people saw themselves, they're wearing garb for playing the ball court game. Let me find my cursor here. The padding on the shoulders of the men. They wore jewelry, they painted themselves. They were dressed up in this particular setting of figurines. They had turban-like hats or headgear of cotton cloth. And there were some women too involved in this. So you can see how these people pictured themselves. And one of their important pursuits was actually cultivating agave all over the Tucson Basin. Okay, I'm just quickly going to go through the uses of agave and why it was so important as a crop when these people, which we can call Hohokam, archaeologists have called them that for a long time, or Hohokam, or actually they are ancestral Atam people who still live here. Ancestral to Atam people. So here is one form. This is a baked agave heart. After the agave has stored its carbohydrates throughout its life and it's baked, it becomes a very sweet food. There's a conversion to a very sugary food. And this is being sold on the street in Guaymas very recently as chunks taken off, and they're eaten as a sweet. Okay, here's another form. People could store the baked agave by pounding it into cakes. And this is an Apache woman doing just that. And once it's dried, it can be stored for a long time, as much as a year or perhaps even a bit more. And the other use for agave is in alcoholic beverages. And this is the outline of a distribution of what this author, Bruman, called mezcal wine. That is, he's not indicating a distilled beverage, but one that is fermented. And he was looking for the distribution of a Mesoamerican related ritual practices. And so he didn't include the Apache use of mezcal beverages because he was thinking they weren't in the Mesoamerican tradition. And in fact, throughout this distribution, people spoke Uto-Aztecan languages. And so they were related in many cultural ways to the people down here in Mexico who shared that practice. Okay, fiber is the other very important product of agave. And in the area here, we find blades that are used for scraping off the pulp to expose the fiber from an agave leaf. We find these in sites in the Tucson Basin. And so these are the blades that would fit into a haft. Actually, this is a hafted tool that was preserved in the Verde Valley. We have not had one preserved like this here, but we know that the blades fit up in there in the same way. These are agave knives or tabular knives, and they have built-in stone handles. So they can, this one's broken, but they can be held and used in the same way to scrape off the pulp. And then the agave fibers are put out to dry, and they have many uses. These are Otomi people in Hidalgo demonstrating this. And here we have many other uses of agave. Ropes, thread, and the thread is made into all sorts of things. We find many spindle and whorls arrangements for spinning thread from the fibers in the Hohokam region, net bags, sandals, and the very indispensable all-time women's carrying baskets, which are made from agave netting. Okay, we're talking about rock pile fields, and I'll show you what we mean by that in a moment. But these are the kinds of fields we find for cultivating agave at the bottom of Tumamoc Hill, and they date about 950 to 700 years ago. So they're at kind of the late end of the Hohokam sequence. And they are not related to the important villages, the important earlier villages on the top of Tumamoc Hill. They are later Hohokam activities. Okay, so where do we find rock pile fields in Arizona? You can see the inset here. And this is a way of showing quantities. So these are the highest quantities, greater than 500 hectares, but the exact densities of rock pile fields that are reported in the as-site files are a function of where archaeologists have done the most survey. So you can just take this as an outline of the distribution, but the quantification really emphasizes where surveys have been conducted to find them in other archaeological sites. Now we're actually getting to Tumamoc Hill. And Tumamoc Hill has those same distinctive tools on the surface that we saw in Oaxaca, on ancient terraces in Oaxaca, and on Perry Mesa. And so that is a great clue to the fact that people were harvesting agaves here in the past as well. The actual fields are mostly on these sides of the major drainage in the Bajada area on the west of Tumamoc Hill. And this is Anklam. This is Greasewood over here. This is Pima Community College. And so you can orient yourself if you're familiar with Tucson, and you can see the kind of area where this is, a very shrubby, very arid part of the Sonoran Desert. Okay, this is what we mean by rock pile fields. They consist of rock piles, which are exactly what they sound like. You can see them here, here. And then there are linear features, which are check dams if they're over a tiny drainage, across a tiny drainage, and we call them terraces if they're more linear in this direction. And all of these features, aside from cultivating agave, make agave cultivation possible in this area, which has no supplemental water, such as irrigation or floodwater sources. The water comes from rainfall runoff after a storm. So the runoff comes down, say down the hill, and it's carrying, it picks up on the surfaces and carrying organics, particles and topsoil and things that storm runoff carries. And they come to a feature like this, and this terrace slows them down, and those suspended sediments are deposited and the water begins to sink in. So they get fertilizer and water at the same time from storm runoff. And you can see one in which an agave is growing. So even the rock piles have the effect of absorbing water and acting as a mulch to keep it in the ground after they've absorbed the runoff. And they have kind of a more porous surface than these hard packed surfaces around them. So when the water comes here in runoff, it actually gets a chance to be absorbed and to infiltrate into the ground. And the mulch effect keeps the water there for a longer time than elsewhere. Okay, this is what the field at Tumamoc Hill looks like. Each of these little dots is a rock pile. And in this lighter greenish color, these are the linear features. And you can see that they form all sorts of patterns of both directing water downhill where the farmers wanted it, and in being more terrace-like features as well. So there are well over 1,000 rock piles. And in and amongst the rock piles are these red circled roasting pits, because you have to roast agave to convert the carbohydrates to a sweet, sugary food that is consumable. Okay, this is a close-up. The previous map was made with a handheld GPS, and this is a map that was made before those were available. And it's a hand-drawn map that shows kind of the pattern. So this is Anklam Road up here at the top, and the water is coming down the slope in this direction toward the drainage. And you can see that all of these linear features, or many of the linear features, are designed to channel water runoff kind of down the hill to where someone would want it, for instance, along this terrace, along this set of terraces. And then there are all the rock piles as well. Okay, how do rock piles and terraces work? Well, one way of looking at that is to sort of ask the plants, how do they work? Do they work? Okay, so we see that in this rock pile, there are many, many more annuals than out here in the hard packed surface area. So the annuals are benefiting from that enhanced moisture in the rock pile from the mulch effect. There are a lot of, we planted these agaves as an experiment of how rock piles work. but you can see that these other plants also prefer living here and enjoying the effects of enhanced moisture. And you can see along the linear features, plants are still responding too. So that's one way of looking at the question, do these work? Yes, they do. Okay, there are other ways that we've tried to look at that question. We buried instruments called, boikos blocks, which are gypsum blocks in the soil, and they have electric leads coming up, and then you attach them to a meter and you get a soil moisture reading. So we could look at that in control areas and in the rock piles. The reason they're in pipe is because it turns out that pack rats really love these electrical leads. They like the insulation, they like the copper, they chewed them off and took them away. And so finally, we had to bury the leads coming up from the boikos blocks in PVC pipe and actually put a top on it so the pack rats couldn't take it. Anyway, we saw that there were moisture readings in the features for days to weeks after a rainfall event, beyond the time when we could get a reading out here in the surrounding area. So they had a measurable effect on water retention. Here was another way we looked at the question of how they worked and did they work. We took soil from inside rock piles and soil from inside controls, and we floated out all of the roots in that soil. And so that was a way, by looking at the roots, we could kind of get a reading that reflected both perennials and annuals, because it's hard to get both of those kinds of plants in the same way, except by the roots, because the annuals might not be there when you counted the perennials, for instance. So we found that there was an 80% greater biomass in roots by weight in the rock piles than in the controls. And this was in 2 different fields. Not a huge sample, but I think quite convincing. Okay, so the dark root amounts are from the rock piles, and these are the controls. In every case, the controls had much less root biomass. Again, here is the features. Here is a distribution of the rock pile features at the bottom of Tumamoc Hill. And note, again, the roasting pits that are scattered among the other agricultural features. Now, in every rock pile field that we have studied, there are recurrent associations that are very distinctive. One is those tools we mentioned before for harvesting agaves. And you can find them in Oaxaca, you can find them in California, well, not in never mind, I was going to say California, you can find them because they do harvest wild agaves. But in any case, in all of the Hohokam rock pile fields, you get these kinds of tools on the surface and you get roasting pits. Here we have some of different sizes. There's the 4th one. This is not at Tumamoc Hill. This is at some rock pile fields near the town of Marana. And again, the rock piles are scattered and they are marked by this. This is a huge roasting pit. Here, when we bisected it, it turned out to be 30 meters in diameter. These are huge pits. And this is a modern Oaxacan roasting pit, just to show you what they look like when they're being used to roast the agaves. So these are the harvested heads with the leaves removed. They're put in the roasting pit along with coals or sometimes the fire is lit in the bottom of the pit. Some pits are lined with rocks, but they always have lots of rocks put in them along with the firewood and the agave heads. And it burns down to coals, and then they're covered with earth, but the rocks that are in the pit retain the heat. So they can be roasted for 24 to 48 hours or as long as is needed to cook them and make them edible. So you see all of these they're called fire-cracked rock and burned rock, and you can see what they look like. They came out of this pit in an earlier reuse. This is the very charcoaly earth that marks the Hohokam roasting pits here with rocks inside them too, and it's exposed in the field. Okay, Tumamoc roasting pits have not been excavated, and they're very difficult to photograph, but there's kind of a mound here with lots of rock. And this one is probably not in the huge range, but maybe something like this Oaxacan roasting pit for comparison. Again, you see all the burned and cracked rocks from the heat, the heads of agaves that are going in there. And here's a smaller roasting pit for comparison in Arizona. But the ashy soil can be taken out and floated. And at Tumamoc, generally where the rodent holes are on these roasting pits, you can see the ashy soil coming up and some burned and vitrified stone. Okay, the roasting pits are very important in establishing agave cultivation because they yield charred agave parts, and they're right in the fields. And this is the different parts that were found in fields near Marana. So different parts of the agave can be identified in the charred material that's floated out in liquid. Okay, here's what some of the contents look like. There are these crystals in agave tissue that are very bright in the light, and sometimes you see the tissue that's been taken out of a roasting pit and it actually sparkles. Now, we didn't know how the rock piles worked when we started, so it looked very casual. It looks like you just put an offset in a rock pile and it'll grow, and that's not much trouble, and then you come along and harvest it. Well, that was a very simple idea that wasn't quite right. So when we plant just one offset in a rock pile, over time it begins to proliferate. We have a dominant agave, which is the first one that's planted, which gets bigger, and then it propagates vegetatively by creating all these offsets, which are clones off the root system, and they all share that same root system. And the offsets don't go outside the rock pile. They're all within it. Like here's one, whoops. Here's one. And they're under the original agave plant, but we never found them going outside the rock piles. Okay, so what must a farmer do if he wants enough of the nutrients to go to a plant that he can harvest it? And this one actually has the stalk going up. Well, they're all sharing the same nutrients. So the farmer needs to direct the energy to several of the larger plants that will mature and then can be harvested. So a farmer, and this is the only farmer that we had in a photograph, and he actually is carrying the offsets around to be planted in other rock piles, pulls off the excess offsets. So they won't take up all of the energy from the same root system, and some of the bigger ones can mature quickly or more quickly. And then those offsets can be put in another rock pile to grow. The same practice we find in the Aztec codices and in plantings for the tequila industry. But what else must the farmer do to make these rock pile, what we call clonal groups, work? All right, when there's a lot of rain and it's wet, the agaves grow very well. This was, again, a single clone at the beginning. And all these offsets are produced. And then as it dries, they die off. And so that's wasting biomass. So the farmer must, if he wants the best harvest from this and the best use of the energy from the clonal group, he would remove some of these offsets and plant them elsewhere before this die-off happens. Okay, what else did we find? We'll show you that process. The initial planting in a rock pile, that was the initial one, and it already has offsets here at the edges of the rock pile. Then there are more offsets. And finally, there are a whole lot of offsets. So the farmer, we learned, should be taking these off and planting them elsewhere and just leaving some of the big ones in staggered ages, so that after this one flowers, another one can become dominant and grow to maturity, and then another one. So the farmer would stagger these according to intervals at which he could speed up the harvest of mature plants. He has to manage them to get the best production. It's not just putting them in a rock pile and going away. So you can see the agave clonal groups in a rock pile self-propagate after the initial harvest for continuing production. It goes on and on. So these, a large one produced a flowering stalk and came to maturity and would have been harvested actually before the flowering stalk goes all the way up. And then there are other ones waiting in the wings to become the next mature plant to harvest. Okay, these are not casual investments, these rock pile fields. They're long-term investments at a generational, heritable timescale. Okay, after 24 years, 8 of the surviving Agave murphyii had flowered. And this is all in terms of Agave murphyii, because those are the only ones that had sustained growth over this long time. After 28 years, many more had flowered once or gotten to a harvestable mature stage once. And after 30 years, some had flowered, some clonal groups in a rock pile had flowered or matured 4 times. So there's a long wait for the first one, and then shorter intervals for continuing production if the farmer manages the offsets in a good way. Okay. We tried 4 species, and only Agave murphyii did well in the long run. These were not huge sample sizes, but they were pretty clear in the consequences. Okay, so these, a farmer plants for the future. Now, we could say these would mature more quickly with more water, and that is certainly true. But these rock pile fields occur in locations where there is no other water available than runoff. So perhaps with greater rainfall in climatic intervals where there's greater rainfall, the production would be a little bit advanced. But really, these are making use for cultivation of areas that are very, very dry, in addition to the irrigated and floodwater fields. Okay, and we find pattern places for rock pile fields. This is a cross-section, idealized cross-section of the basin near Marana. And we find that there are other kinds of farming, but agaves are cultivated on the driest of slopes where the water cannot be diverted to the side from drainages crossing the basin. Rock pile fields are also in settlement settings. We call the clusters of settlement for the Hohokam Classic period communities. And by community, we mean all of the settlements that are contemporary and that are clustered around a central large site with a platform mound. So this is what we call the Marana community, and it's been surveyed to determine where all these sites are. So the black ones are classic period, and it covers 55 square miles. And this, you can look at these sites in here, and they are all rock pile fields. And there are other smaller ones scattered around, but we worked with the large rock pile fields because we wanted to see how they were organized, and they are the ones that involved multiple farmers, lots of farmers who had to decide how they were going to organize the land and share roasting pits. Okay, this is an artist's reconstruction of the platform mound in the Marana Community Center. It was done for a magazine, an archaeological magazine. It's a little flamboyant. The platform mound isn't quite that high, but people lived in what we call compounds with adobe dwellings. And there are 42 of these around the platform mound with an estimated 800 to 1,000 residents. Now, that was enough people that they needed to get production out of every part of their agricultural landscape. And rock pile fields were the way to do that in the driest parts. Okay, and we studied and compared 4 communities, each with a platform mound. Here's Tumamok and Zanardelli. The rock pile fields in each are indicated as just a general area. And then the mountain fronts that contributed sediments to the fields and determined the substrate for the fields. And there are different mountain ranges, Santa Rita's, the Tucson Mountains, the Tortolita, and they have different geological compositions. So we're looking at rock pile fields that had totally different substrates based on the geological sources for that outwash. Okay, we had, as you can see, every kind of field sediment source, but the rock piles were constructed on each of those outwash sediments. It didn't matter, it worked. Okay, we're looking again at the roasting pits. And roasting pits are communal facilities. The roasting pits were of a size, remember this one has an eventual 30-meter diameter when it was totally exposed. So these aren't used by a family or a household. They have user groups that collectively use them. So what does that mean in terms of rock pile fields? Lots of people, and this one isn't even nearly the biggest in the Tucson rock pile fields. And they have to gather the wood, dig the pit, bring the agave hearts, and maintain the pits, clean them out after they're used. Okay, so we're assuming when we're trying to find what the social fabric is among farmers who use the same rock pile field and the same roasting pit, what is that fabric that gives us some idea of what the cooperating units are in a large rock pile field? And by large, we're using all large rock pile fields in this analysis, which means they're over 10 hectares. Okay, why can we think of them as a community, contemporary community use? Well, the rock piles still work. So there was no reason to discontinue their use. They're renewed by every rain, including fertility. The ceramic styles date them all to the classic period, which is toward the end of the Hohokam sequence. So this form of field was not used much before that, and they all have occupational use during a particular period. So they weren't used forever. Okay, anyone who used them would have an expectation of a 20-year plus future investment just for the initial harvest, and then they could get sustained production from well-managed clonal groups. And we have evidence for extended reuse of oversized roasting pits. So all this implies that these could be considered a contemporary system. And that lets us ask the question of, are there any regularities? How much land in rock pile field would be contributing agaves to a shared collective roasting pit or common roasting pit? And we found that when we took the total area in rock pile fields and divided by the number of roasting pits, so you have amounts of land going, giving agaves for roasting to a single roasting pit, we found that there was a fairly narrow range, much narrower than we had anticipated. So for 3 of these communities, they're in that range, 13.2 to 17.3 hectares per roasting pit. And to us, that suggests the concept of an appropriate modal size for cultivated land associated with one oversized roasting pit that was shared by what anthropologists would call a corporate group. Now, this is a lot of land for any single household or extended family. So this is another user's association with rights to that land that is larger. It could be the people who use a particular roasting pit and this much acreage, and a hectare is 2.47 acres. So it's like 32 to 42 acres. Could be the residents of a small village, could be a part of a village, it could be some other kind of users association, but there is a regularity to that. McClellan community is a different kind of ratio, and it was used over the longest time, and it has the most dense settlement. So perhaps there were more people cooperating on individual roasting pits. Okay, and then we also suspect subholdings in these big fields of a size in which an individual extended family or large household could closely monitor each rock pile. We don't think that all the field was owned collectively, but there were these corporate groups for parts of them, recognized parts of them, and then there would be a smaller group that would be able to just monitor closely the rock piles, remove the offsets, know when they needed to be harvested, stagger the maturity sizes of agaves, and manipulate them and manage them for greatest output. So here's kind of a suggestion in this one rock pile field that might be the holdings of this smaller group, where they would use one rock pile, and that would be all of their one roasting pit, and those would be all of their rock piles. But usually these are all merged together and you can't see individual groups like this. So we see 2 levels. Okay, What have we learned by experimenting in the Tumamoc fields and looking at the larger settings of rock pile fields in Hohokam communities that were multi-sites and had a central settlement with a platform mound as public architecture for the whole community? What have we learned? Okay. Rock pile fields are highly flexible dryland technology because they are productive on field substrates derived from outwash with variable, outwash from mountain ranges with variable geological sources. So that's what determines the character of the substrate, and they can be constructed on any of those substrates and were across the basin. What surprised us, and we didn't know at all before the Tumamoc experiments, was that the unit of production in rock pile fields is a clonal group that shares the same root system and is all genetically the same because the offsets that are produced are clones of the original planting. So that is the productive unit of production rather than individual agave plants that you see in fields, say, for tequila and mezcal and other uses of agave plants in modern times and in the past as well, as we saw in the Aztec Codex. So the clonal group is the protective unit, not the individual agave plant. And that's in contrast to many regions with higher rainfall and less extreme heat. For instance, those fields that we saw in Oaxaca were 20 to 27 inches of rainfall, a good deal more than we have here. So farmers must manage clonal groups by removing and replanting excess offsets for high yield. If they want maximum yield, they have to manage them in that way because they're all sharing the nutrients, the same nutrient source. Okay. Rock pile fields attain long-term investment, not an immediate return, with as much as 20 plus years until first harvest after planting. Subsequent prolonged production from clonal groups, in turn, provides an extended timescale amenable to clonal group heritability across generations. That is, someone may plant the first rock pile, but it continues to produce across time so that it would be handed down through generations. And we believe we can find two levels of societal concepts that guide the modal size of collective use and property rights. There's a higher order one that, as I said, anthropologists would call a corporate group, with field rights in a modal size range of 13.2 to 17.3 hectares. That's not exact, but that's kind of a range, a fairly narrow range when we divide roasting pits into the total field area, with the idea that that size area in the rock pile field, in a large rock pile field, would represent the effort and harvest of the farmers in that kind of area would contribute effort and harvest to a shared roasting pit. Okay, and that's a pretty big area. As I said, that's about 32 to 42 acres. So that's a good size. Then we have a lower order subholder group consisting of a size for perhaps extended families or households or other smaller cooperative associations of a size that were such that individual management and harvest could be accomplished for specific subsets of rock piles. So they would be responsible and probably had property rights in a way to that harvest, whereas the larger group had collective use of a larger area in this range of size. Okay, I think we're now ready to answer questions. And let's see, we need to.
All right. Thank you, Susie. That was such an awesome overview. First of all, I'll give applause like we will all properly be doing in person. I know everyone's doing in their living room. Man, that community shared use of the agaves and the roasting pits and the management just really makes me think of the implications relative to tragedy of the commons or common pool resource theory and all that school of work. Interesting correlation. So we have some awesome questions that folks have contributed. Just a quick couple logistics notes for everybody. We are going to go over the 7 o'clock time period, but not by a lot necessarily. However, there's a lot of great questions queued up. So do stick with us for a little bit. And if you have some questions, please do enter them into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. But we'll also be mindful of your time and certainly not go before about 7:30 at the latest. So let's start off here. In 2018, I assisted with planting some agaves on Tumamok as part of the Agave Heritage Festival. First of all, thank you. And then how are the agaves growing? Any issues with mites, worms, or any other typical issues that come up with agaves? I can definitely feel that, but if you want to take a first pass, Paul or Susie, from what you've seen, if you've checked in on them, and I'm happy to address that as well.
Okay, the agaves were first planted on the Marana fields in 1984 and in 1987 in the Tumamoc fields. And
they're also referring to the ones in that we did right by the flagpole here by the buildings.
2 years ago.
That was 2 years ago.
You'd better answer.
Yeah. So those agaves that we looked at in the Tumamoc fields have been there ever since 1987. The last 2 years of horrible lack of rainfall and probably climate change have really been very hard on them. But until that time, they did well. There was some attrition. Remember, we were experimenting. We didn't know how any of this worked. There's no written record or narrative, autumn narrative we know of that deals with how to cultivate agave in rock pile fields. So we were, just trying whatever would work. And we didn't anticipate the progression, but we have not had any predation from insects that we could predict, but javelina, some deer that got in at Tumamok have chewed on them. It's been pretty minor, and when offsets are chewed on by some kind of mammal, you get more offsets too. Yeah. So it's not a zero-sum game in that sense. The group keeps on putting more out. Okay.
And like during the past 2 years, the extreme drought has made agaves particularly vulnerable to rodent and small mammal predation. And in the 1980s, I think 1985, we lost a lot of the agaves near Marana due to rodent predation.
And we also planted offsets that were too small. A Zapotec friend who knows agaves very well, cultivating agaves very well, and who actually lives in Tucson, told us that we had planted offsets that were really too small. They were quite vulnerable, and the larger the offset that is planted, the less time to maturity and harvest. So what farmers want is maturity to harvest as quickly as possible.
Good. Susie, would you mind ending your share of your screen? And I'll just also add that the agaves we planted, perfect. 2 years ago here at the demonstration garden, are doing pretty well. We planted a couple species, and just like your results, Susie, the Terraces that we planted, unfortunately, they're beautiful plants that Gary Nabhan contributed. They did not last long at all.
They
But
could
and
grow
we're also,
somewhere else, but just not in the
yes,
very low, hot
right, exactly.
environment of Tumamoc Hill.
And they also are already putting out offsets, several of them. So, all right, let's keep moving. So Judy Bronstein asked a great question. At present, the lower slopes of Tumamoc are considerably too low for agave to grow naturally. Yes, that's accurate.
Yes,
And at the
too
time,
hot.
too hot, yep. At the
Yes.
time that agave was being cultivated here, were there also wild agave growing? One more indication of a climatic shift over the past millennium? Or was Tumamoc below the native range of agave at that point as well? Great question, Judy.
We suspect there certainly there are no agave growing at that elevation in the basin today. And we assume probably they were all planted, they were enhanced in their moisture environment by the rock pile fields. And I think that's what enabled them to grow in the Tumamoc fields. That would not be in the probably ideal environment or even survivable environment for Murphyii, maybe for agave deserti, which does occur, but not in the Tucson Basin. It stops at the western edge of the Tucson Basin. So, that's hard to evaluate, but that would be the only one that I know of that would grow under the same conditions.
And we have fairly good evidence that agave was grown in even hotter, drier places. Our highest ubiquities or frequencies of agave plant parts occurs in Phoenix for the Hohokam region, and it appears to have been an important plant throughout the Hohokam region.
And it may have also been grown with tailwater from around the edges of irrigated fields. And that's a position you often see it growing today in Mexico as hedgerows.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'm telling you all, these are awesome questions. So this next one is from Tanya. She says, I know Tumamoc Hill has two principal types of soils with distinct plant associations down on the flats, red clay versus gray gravel. Do you see any differences in the placement of rock piles with respect to soil type?
No, we think they are placed where they're placed to receive maximum runoff. Moisture is the limiting factor. So I think probably farmers stood out there in the rain, found exactly where there was an opportunity for water to collect, which they, enhanced with terraces and things like that caught the runoff. And that was their principal design and purpose for putting them where they did.
All right. Next question, are all the agave fields in the Tucson Basin in the Santa Cruz drainage?
Well, it depends.
By definition, yes, right?
It is interesting that the fields aren't nearly as extensive in the eastern Tucson Basin.
I think that's what the question is getting at.
That is the Pantano and Tanca Verde Prieto Basin.
I would just add that as Wendy's shared with us in her presentation last month, there are ample similar rock piles and agave fields in the San Pedro River Basin.
Yeah.
And we showed that map of their distribution in southern and central Arizona, and it's quite broad. And the variety of features is different from place to place to place. In some places in the San Pedro, they're more terraces and kind of grids even. And if you go to the Safford area, they're huge grids. So, you know, depending on cultural preferences and environmental variables, you know, these things are quite varied across time and space, taking advantage of local opportunities.
All right. This next question from Jack Dash. Given that these agaves were and continue to be primarily clonally reproduced, is there any evidence that there is adaptation or gradual evolution occurring in these plants? In other words, are the agave murphyi of today identical to those of the Hohokam Classic period in terms of drought tolerance, pest resistance, etc., or are they adapting to new biotic and abiotic factors without sexual reproductions? Jack, I'll just mention that is a stellar question, and I have a new graduate student, Natasha Riccio, who's going to be joining the lab soon and looking at just that. But Paul and Susan, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think farmers observe, traditional farmers observe very carefully the differences in their agaves. And so if there's a mutation in an offset, say, that gives a different morphological or behavioral outcome, then they could select those and replant them preferentially. But any recombination, there's no seed set involved in these. These are responding to cultivation using vegetative reproduction. So there's no recombination through flowering and that sort of thing, but they might look at minute morphological variation. And actually, Wendy and Andrew Salomon would be better people to answer that. But certainly in terms of linguistics, farmers often have terms for variation in their agave plants below what we use as the species level. So they may distinguish attributes that we don't recognize by species or subspecies. So certainly that kind of variation is being monitored and responded to by farmers.
A colleague of ours, Jeffrey Parson, who's done an ethnoarchaeological study of agaves, agave utilization in Hidalgo, one of his informants who had both natural and cultivated agaves in his use area recognized, I think it was almost 50 varieties of agaves that he was utilizing in his fields.
And he planted, quote, wild and cultivated ones in his fields. It was not necessarily a major choice. If you got offset from wild ones and cultivated ones, that was
50
okay.
varieties, amazing. Okay, Rachel asked, and maybe I'll take a crack at it and tell me from it, which agave species are featured in this presentation? Pretty much agave murphyi, I believe you were referring to the Hohokam. Yeah.
And then, all our metrics are really about agave murphyi.
Gotcha. And then, so Rachel, you also asked which ones are the ones that are harvested by farmers in Arizona. I would really just, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on that, I'll just reference you to Wendy's talk last month. She goes into great detail on that, on the domesticates. I guess maybe let me morph that into a question for you and Paul and Susie. Have you seen any evidence that was another species grown in the Tucson Basin other than murphyi?
Yes. And Paul will talk about that.
The knives that Susie showed photographs of that were used for removing the outer surface of the leaves to expose the fibers come in different sizes, and there's a bimodal distribution in widths. And in that photograph, there was an metal knife at the top of the two stone knives with handles. And that metal knife was purchased in a market in Ishmaquilpan. And its width exactly duplicates the width of many of the stone knives here in the Tucson Basin, making us think that Agave murphyi, which probably does come from originally from Mexico, but probably more northern Mexico, but maybe some of the larger varieties of Mexican agaves were also grown in this region, because you would have a width of the knife that would more or less co-vary with the width of the leaves.
And certainly these farmers were quite sophisticated, I'm sure, in deciding which agaves they wanted, because you would choose some for fiber properties, you would choose some for edible properties, you might choose some for really easy fermentation for alcoholic beverages. So for given all the uses of agave, it just seems self-evident that farmers were choosing different agaves for different properties they wanted in the harvested plants.
Cool.
It's very hard to distinguish even species level in the remains from the roasting pits. I mean, that's what we would really like. There's the shape of the spine. We don't have reproductive parts in the roasting pits, which is what we need for our taxonomy, because the agave is harvested before it sends up its stalk and depletes the resources in the plant. So it's very hard without reproductive parts.
I'll have to dig into the pack rat middens for that.
Yeah.
Doug asked, does Agave murphyi take 24 years to mature, as you showed in some of your data?
Agave murphyi can mature in a much shorter time if it gets more water. So if you watered these agaves, they would mature much more quickly. And there have been experiments in plant sciences for commercial uses that showed that just some stray water from at the edge of an irrigated field can increase the time to maturity greatly. But these rock pile fields are expanding production onto what otherwise would have been marginal land. So where they can get irrigation or floodwater farming, they plant corn or something, that is more very much a staple in diet, an annual crop that uses more water. So this is the more expanding production onto land that would be too marginal for any other kind of cultivation. So, it's the lack of water that makes them
Makes sense. Slow down. Yeah.
slow down. And it's not that they're planting them in the fields that are the best watered at all.
Yeah.
Except maybe as hedgerows.
Cool. John Hartman asked, were the agave hearts the main part of the Hohokam diet? And is agave a nutritious food with the essential amino acids? Oh my, yes, indeed.
It's a very nutritious food, and it supplies a sweet food that wasn't too common in earlier times. There weren't lots of sweet foods. So I think it was a treat. It was served probably at festivals as it is right now. But I think ethnographically, the highest contribution to diet from agave calories that we know of, which again would be among the Otomi, would be maybe 12%. It's not a staple food, but it has these other uses too. And it is something that can be harvested out of season if times are tough and people don't have enough food.
All right. Excellent answer. John Hartman, Jim McWilliams wonders, were the agave fields still in use when the Spanish arrived?
No, No.
Although there's a wonderful quote from Perez de Ribes in the early 1600s when he visited the Lower Pima and describes, we think of the clonal group as distinctly Hohokam, but apparently they were doing the same kind of thing in Sonora. And I'll just read you a little quote. It is a flavorful and sweet, and they grind it up to make a type of preserve. When one or more of its roots is cut, new shoots will sprout for this. Therefore, once this vineyard, he characterized them as vineyards of sorts, is planted, it lasts for many years. There's a longer description of them clearly being cultivated plants in association with houses.
Indoor yard gardens.
Fascinating. So, wow. So
Of course,
what?
he said they matured in 1 to 2 years. He didn't know everything about it. Yeah.
Kind of following up on that question. So how long have you been able to identify or think that discontinuity, the gap of from, up until what point, how long, how many years ago were agaves cultivated? What is the most recent evidence here on Tumamok, for example?
Well, it would be in the late classic period, perhaps up to 1450. And we believe there are a number of reasons that practice ceased. Missionaries brought scattered populations together around missions. There was a great deal of loss of population to disease. There was a lot of disruption, and there were raiding economies when groups had horses and guns. So it became probably more dangerous to have fields at a distance from residences. And with lower populations, we would guess that they focused more on irrigation and floodwater farming that would be nearer their homes. I mean, this is very hard to prove, but given all the things that happened at contact, it makes a lot of sense. And the other possibility is that I think when cattle became available, they were very attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of, investing energy in rock pile fields, you could let the cattle harvest the vegetation over wide distances and come back and have meat to eat. So, those are kind of choices. People make economic choices. And it's hard to prove, but those are factors that might have entered into it, and particularly the population loss due to disease.
Thanks. Marilyn wonders, does roasting time depend on the size of hearts or quantity of rocks? Can that even be determined? She's wondering how people make the decision of how long to cook.
Experience that we don't have. These are big roasting pits too. So maybe you could get a high heat for fewer heads in a small one, but with these great big ones, when we look around in Mexico, I think 24 to 48 hours would be a minimum. And there are people who are still roasting agaves, and I think they use extended times. Certainly, the kind of rocks make a difference because they have differential heat retention qualities. And what can you get hardwood for? Like, can you get a lot of mesquite for the fires to make the coals too?
And as maybe will be discussed tomorrow night, there are different shapes of pits and different technologies of firing that are done, for example, in Sonora to more quickly roast a few heads of agave.
I was going to say the same thing, Paul, that Marilyn, make sure to tune in for the tasting tomorrow and ask Jesus Garcia that very question. He'll have a lot. So Jesus, we'll talk about this, runs the, has put in a roasting pit at Mission Gardens that does an annual harvest, which we're cooking something up to do something there, hopefully in May as a culmination to the series. So Are the agave hearts only good to roast after they begin to flower, or can this work before flowering? I guess harvesting prematurely.
Harvesting is most common among many groups, just as the flowering begins to start, because once, it takes a great deal of energy, stored energy, to send up that big flower stalk. So, there would be a competition between people and the reproductive action. In fact, some groups do what they call castrating the agave. They cut off that flowering stalk when it begins to appear because they want to conserve the energy that would be expended otherwise in that one big stalk going up very rapidly.
But it can be a starvation food. People would prefer not to sacrifice the optimum, but
yeah.
Eric wonders, do offsets need to be treated or prepared in any way prior to transplant? If so, what is the process?
We have been advised by, modern gardeners and by our Zapotec friend and others that you let them develop a callus. You pull them off, let them lie on the ground and develop a callus before they're replanted. And again, if the smaller the offset, the longer the time to harvestability. So the larger the offset, the least time to harvest.
And the most likely it is to survive. The biggest problem we had generally was getting the initial offset established. Once they're established, they're pretty hardy, but we had a lot of casualties, even when we think we planted them correctly and followed our Zapotec's advice. We did lose a lot of agaves initially.
And nurse trees helped. Shade was good.
Yeah,
we're seeing that in the garden here.
I think, and we've talked about this a lot, that they probably had sort of nursery plantings as they do in Mexico, and the offsets got fairly large before they transplanted them too.
Yeah, they pulled them off. I've seen this in Oaxaca. They pulled off the offsets, had a special planting bed where they could actually water them.
Yes.
Add water from outside the rainfall source and get them a little bigger and then transplant them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see where I want to go. Marilyn wonders, do you know of anyone studying the way the mescaleros in any region are using agave for food and making use of that work in any way?
Oh, I think there are many people, for instance, studying all of those things in Sonora, say, at the present time. Mexican agronomists, not Mexican archaeologists so much that we know of, but yeah, there's an agave renaissance going on in Sonora that I think many researchers are looking at all those things.
Excuse me. Zan asks a fun question next. I think this gets at kind of the mechanics of roasting. Can I roast my own agave heads in the oven at low temperature?
Yes, you can, and Carolyn Neathammer does that. She is a person who has produced cookbooks with that kind of information. Yes. And
I didn't expect that answer.
At Mission Garden.
And it tastes similar?
Maybe not quite as smoky.
Not nearly as smoky.
Yeah.
Cool.
Our colleague Charles Mexicek, who is an archaeobotanist that did the analysis of the flotation remains and worked with us a lot in the 80s, used to bake agave in his oven.
Yeah.
All right, next potluck. Another question here. Are there archaeological indications of rock pile fields and roasting pits in the Gila River area west of Gila Bend at the Patayan-Hohokam borderline? If so, do you think they were agave murphyi?
I don't know of any west of Gila Bend rock pile fields. East of Gila Bend, they're extensive and large, like the Tucson Basin, through Florence and beyond along the Gila River. They were important components. I have seen photographs, Dave Doyle, of what I think are agave murphyi in Papagoria, in that general area, but at higher elevations than and not in association with archaeological sites.
Yeah. But remember, you don't have to have rock piles or even rock features to grow agaves. Earthen berms are often used, and features that channel runoff in a certain way may be just made with brush. So you can't discount them being cultivated in the absence of rock piles. But we certainly know where they were cultivated using rock piles.
All right, last question here. Ariana asks, thanks you for such a lovely and interesting talk, and says, is there any evidence of relationships, cultural exchanges, or communication between the Aztecs and the Tumamoc people?
Well, that's, directly, we don't know of it, but all the way from Dam occupations down through West Mexico and to the Aztecs, people are speaking languages in a larger linguistic group called Uto-Aztecan. And so we know when the Spanish came that there were mutually intelligible groups way down into Sonora. And in fact, the lower Pima are O'odham people who live in Sonora.
Through Sinaloa.
Yeah, all the way down through Sinaloa. But these are, it's a large language group. And I guess it's some question, and probably a linguist could answer this, how far south you can go where languages are variants, but still mostly mutually intelligible, which would foster intercommunication. And we know that the Aztecs always said that they came from the north. So,
and we do see distributions of material culture in this area that are specific, at least in the United States, to the Hohokam, but continue throughout West Mexico. Markers of personal identity, for example, the kinds of shell jewelry people wore, the kinds of clothing they manufactured, and the ways they manufactured it. Specialized spindle whorls, for example, to manufacture cotton thread, to produce very tight threads, are specific to the Hohokam area, but continue south through Sinaloa and Nayarit, West Mexico in particular, all over Mexico.
And there are large areas where people had shared concepts of public architecture, ball courts and platform mounds.
And it may be that agave cultivation, as it relates to mezcal wine and the use of alcoholic beverages, Ruhlman points out that not only was the Gila River ethnographically the greatest extent, furthest north extent of these Mesoamerican practices of using alcoholic beverages in ceremony and ritual, but also the people in this area made the greatest variety of them north of central Mexico, with Saguaro wine being the most famous, but alcohol made out of all kinds of suitable substances as a base.
Well,
and that ends with, it doesn't go to the Puebloan area. It ends with the down here.
Yeah, the Puebloan people do not make alcoholic beverages.
such an excellent answer. Thank you. You two are the best. This has been so good. Thank you, everyone. I think everyone gave their best shot to stump you. That sure didn't happen. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you as always for enlightening us and connecting us with so much knowledge. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Please be sure to join tomorrow evening for the tasting with Doug and Jesus Garcia, focusing local Sonoran spirits. If you would like to purchase spirits to accompany your tasting, do so. You can find the link to the Hotel Congress bottle shop and the Agave Renaissance tasting pairings that you can do through that. It's the way liquor laws are right now that you have to buy the whole bottle. It's a blessing in disguise, I guess. So everyone, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe and enjoy this beautiful weather. Paul and Susie, thank you again, and good night.
See you tomorrow.